It was a hot summer in the small town, and the air was thick and sticky as tar. Ava was coming home from work that day, carrying a small backpack and dreaming of cold lemonade on their front porch. She was only 20, and there were boundless horizons ahead of her, plans for college, dreams of moving to the big city and becoming a journalist, of writing about injustice and helping those whose voices were not heard. But fate, as it turned out, had other plans. She didn't immediately notice the police car that was slowly following her down the empty street. Her thoughts were far away, and it was only when she heard a sharp signal that Ava stopped and looked back. The policeman stopped the car and got out, keeping his hand on his holster. "Papers," he threw in briefly. Her heart shook. She'd heard the stories, knew it happened, but she'd always thought it was somewhere far away, in big cities where life was boiling. Here, in their small town, everyone knew each other, and no one thought something like this could happen. Ava slowly reached for her bag, trying not to make any sudden movements like her mother had taught her. But something went wrong. Maybe it was the look on her face. Maybe it was the hesitant look in her eyes. The policeman suddenly drew his gun, and everything happened in a split second. A flash of pain, a bright light, then darkness. Ava woke up in the hospital a few days later. Her face was bandaged so tightly that she could hardly move. The noise of the machines around her, the muffled conversations of the nurses, it all seemed like a dream. The doctors explained that she had undergone a complicated surgery. A bullet had hit her face, and to save her life, surgeons had to reconstruct her jaw and eye. But the physical pain was nothing compared to what Ava felt when she realized that she would never be able to move like she had before. The bullet had also grazed her spine, and now her future looked very different. Dreams of journalism, of moving away, all of it crumbled in an instant. In the eyes of her mother, who sat next to her, Ava saw a reflection of her new reality: pity, fear, and powerlessness. But underneath that pain was anger, not just at the policeman, but at the whole system that allowed this to happen. Ava silently turned away from her mother to the window, watching the raindrops rolling down the glass. She knew she had a long road ahead of her, a road of recovery and struggle. But was she ready to take it? Ava lay motionless, feeling every minute of the stretching pain as if her body belonged to someone else. The windows of the room barely let in the light of the fall day, and the muffled voices of the nurses could be heard outside the door. She could hear her mother talking to the doctor, but she couldn't bring herself to listen. Her thoughts were far away, in the moment when the bullet pierced the air and her life changed forever. The door opened, and her mother entered the room quietly, her eyes downcast. The woman sat down on the edge of the bed and gently touched her daughter's hand. Ava didn't react, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, as if she could find the answers to all her questions there. "Ava," her mother whispered, her voice shaking, "you have to talk to a lawyer. You have to. We have to do something." "Do what?" Ava answered coldly, not even looking at her. "How do I fight this? I won't be able to walk anymore. I'm not who I was anymore." The mother sighed, her eyes filling with tears. "You're strong. You've always been strong. It's not over. It's over." Ava interrupted her, the sudden rage giving her strength. "Do you think it can be undone? That someone will be punished for what happened? He's a cop, Mom. A white cop. And I'm a black girl who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Who needs me?" Her voice broke, and she buried her face in the pillow, holding back her tears with all her might. Her mother sat silently beside her, stroking her arm, not knowing what to say. A few hours later, a lawyer and a social worker entered the room. The lawyer was an elderly white man with glasses and a folder of documents under his arm. The social worker, a woman named Michelle, was black and immediately approached Ava with a soft smile. "Ava, I'm Michelle. I'm here to help you through this. I know it's hard for you right now, but your mom and I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We're going to fight." Ava regarded her quietly. The woman's face expressed concern and confidence, but Ava couldn't bring herself to believe that fighting would change anything. She looked at the lawyer, who sat down across from her, and got straight to the point. "We are preparing a lawsuit against the police," he began. "There are witnesses who saw that officer exceeding his authority. We have reason to believe it was racial profiling. But I have to be honest with you, Ava, these cases go, Ava replayed over and over in her head the moment when everything had gone wrong. She remembered that terrible day in every detail, as if she were trying to find the key to the answer. Why had it happened to her? The image of the policeman before her eyes became clearer and clearer. His cold stare, the tense hand on his holster, and worst of all, his voice. She couldn't forget his voice. "Hey!" A harsh, contemptuous shout brought her out of her thoughts as she walked home. Ava turned around and saw a police car moving slowly behind her. The policeman, a white male with a scowl on his face, opened the door and stepped out of the car. There was something menacing in his movements. "ID," he demanded, not bothering to introduce himself. Ava froze, her heart racing. She knew to be careful, to move slowly, to speak calmly, not to provoke. But inside, everything was boiling. Why her? Why was this happening to her again? To people like her? "What did I do?" She dared to ask, her voice low, almost a whisper. The policeman grimaced, as if her words made him cringe. "Are you deaf?" He stepped closer, his hand already resting on his holster. "I said the papers. Immediately. Or do you want trouble?" Ava slowly reached for her backpack, trying not to make any sudden movements, as she had always been taught. But the policeman seemed to be aggressive from the start. "Hurry up!" he shouted, his voice growing louder and angrier. "Do you think you can disobey orders? Or do you think that rules don't apply to people like you?" She froze, feeling cold fear piercing her entire body. His words were soaked with hatred. She knew what he was talking about, even if he didn't say it directly. For people like her, a black girl in a world where her life wasn't worth as much as the lives of others. "Yep, I'm just going home," she said, her voice shaking. She knew she couldn't just leave, but it was dangerous to stay where she was either. The policeman stepped forward sharply, grabbing her arm. She was barely able to stay on her feet from his sudden jerk. "I said papers," he growled right in her face. His eyes blazed with rage, as if any resistance from her, any attempt to explain herself, would only fuel his hatred. "You damn scum, I command you." Ava tried to free her hand in horror, but he held it too tightly. It had all happened so fast. She didn't realize that her movements, her attempt to protect herself, were the reason his hand was on the weapon. His shout rang out like a clap of thunder. "Don't move! Don't you dare move!" And before she realized what was happening, a shot rang out. In an instant, the whole world, full of rage and terror, fell into a deafening silence. In the ward, Ava woke abruptly from her thoughts, her breathing quickening. The image of the policeman, his scream, his cruel gaze, it was all in her mind, and she couldn't get rid of it. At that moment, the door opened again, and her mother entered with a new batch of news from the lawyer. But Ava did not care. No justice, no trial could give her back what she had lost. "I can never forget it," she whispered, hardly to herself. Her mother sat down beside her, her eyes full of pain. "We will fight, Ava," she said, her voice firm, but the tears glistening on her cheeks spoke of how deep the pain was. "We're going to get to the truth. We can't just let them do this. That man has to answer for what he did." Ava clenched her fists, her eyes staring out the window again. The voice of that policeman echoed in her head over and over again. He had ordered her to obey, but now she would not be silent any longer. Ava felt herself getting hot. The memory of that terrible day kept coming back to her mind. The image of the policeman, his harsh order, the fire of hatred in his eyes, it all burned in her mind. She remembered every second when her life had been divided into before and after, and it was at that moment that the policeman's decisive shot became the climax of her nightmare. "Don't move!" His voice rolled like a roll of thunder. It was not just an order, it was the order of a man who was used to authority, who felt himself master of the situation. But Ava moved. Fear and self-preservation instinct overwhelmed her. She tried to free herself from his grip, trying to explain that she was just going home. But there was no room for explanation in the officer's eyes. There was no compassion in them, no desire to understand, just contempt and cold hatred. He tugged her arm sharply as if proving his authority. "I said don't move," he repeated, his voice even more threatening. Ava froze, her heart pounding in her chest, so hard she feared its pounding would be heard outside. Fear gripped her, but her brain refused to believe this was really happening. Her fingers slid inside the backpack where her wallet and documents were. She did everything slowly so as not to cause more aggression. But in the policeman's eyes, any movement she made looked like a threat. He was ready to act, his hand resting nervously on his gun, ready to fire at any second. "Are you hiding something? Are you hiding something?" The policeman shouted louder and louder, as if losing control of himself. His fingers gripped the weapon tighter, and his eyes were determined, as if he'd already made up his mind and wasn't going to back down. Ava froze in place, raising her hands in a sign that she was obeying, but it was all happening too fast. "Don't, I just—" He didn't let her finish. Another second, and the air exploded with the deafening sound of a gunshot. The bullet whizzed through the air and struck Ava in the head with incredible force. For a moment, the world around her froze, the sound disappeared, and everything in her head went silent. She fell to the ground, not realizing what had happened. It was as if the life had been ripped from her body along with her pulse, which had suddenly slowed. When Ava woke up in the hospital, the first thing she felt was a sharp, piercing cold. The doctor said she had miraculously survived, but her life would never be the same again. The bullet had grazed her cheekbone, traveled in a slip through her head, but left her crippled. Her face was changed forever. After the surgery, Ava no longer recognized herself in the mirror. Her jaw was damaged, and she could barely open her mouth, and the sight in one eye was lost forever. A severe head injury had also affected her ability to move. Nerve damage had left her partially paralyzed. Her lower body no longer obeyed her, and months of rehabilitation lay ahead. But something even greater had changed in Ava. Her spirit. Instead of the fear she had felt before the shooting, now rage boiled up inside her. Not just because of her own suffering, but because of the racism and power the police officer had abused. Michelle, the social worker who had been supporting Ava, sat beside her bed, trying to find words of comfort. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "You've been victimized, not just by this cop, but by an entire system that has gone too long without taking responsibility for its actions." Ava, looking up at the ceiling, barely moved her lips. "He didn't see me as a person. He only saw my skin." Michelle nodded, understanding her feelings. Behind her professional composure was the same pain that Ava had, the pain of racial injustice that ran deep in society. "We will fight, Ava," she said, her voice full of determination. "We will fight for you and for all those affected by this system. You are not alone." Ava was silent, her eyes still staring into the void. But something new was brewing inside her. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was anger and a desire for justice. After the shot, time seemed to stop. Ava lay on the cold pavement, her body unresponsive and her eyes blurring. The sounds merged into a muffled buzzing, but at the same moment her mind caught one thing clearly. The policeman didn't even approach her to help her. He didn't bend down to see if she was alive, didn't try to stop the bleeding. He just stood there, as if it didn't matter. The cop, the same white cop Ava would always remember, calmly holstered his weapon as if he'd done his duty. His face remained impenetrable, as if it were just another day on the job. His eyes expressed neither regret nor fear, only cold indifference. He glanced at Ava, as if assessing the result of his order. Her body lay on the sidewalk, twitching weakly in spasms, blood slowly dripping from the wound on her head, mixing with the dirt on the road. The officer sighed, reached for his radio, and calmly reported, "Suspect neutralized, ambulance required." Not a word about the fact that he shot an unarmed young woman who tried to obey his orders. Not a word about the racist rage that guided his actions. To him, it was just another neutralized threat. There wasn't even a doubt in his mind that he might have made a mistake. In his mind, she was not a person, but an object, a black figure that had to be stopped, even if it took a shot to do so. He didn't approach Ava, didn't call for help right away. His actions were slow and deliberately detached, as if he didn't want to touch what he felt was unworthy of attention. People passing by stopped in horror. Someone started screaming. A woman with a child in her arms dropped her bag and, covering her face with her hands, screamed, "Oh my God, she's still alive! Do something!" The crowd began to gather around, slowly but surely. People took out their phones, filming what was happening. Some started calling an ambulance. Some shouted indignant words at the policeman, but he stood like a rock, unperturbed, as if what was happening didn't concern him. His job was done and he saw no tragedy in what had happened. "Hey, what are you doing?" shouted a man from the crowd, stepping forward. "She's dying! You have to help her!" But the officer only waved the man away like an annoying insect, not even giving him a glance. He didn't move or make any attempt to approach Ava. Perhaps in his eyes, she was just another threat who got what she deserved. The crowd grew larger and angrier. People started shouting accusations and questions filled the space. "You just shot her for no reason? Was she armed? She was just walking down the street. It's because it's black, isn't it?" The words cut the air like knives, but the policeman didn't react. His face remained indifferent. He just stood by the car, waiting for reinforcements, as if it were routine, as if he shot unarmed people in the street every day. Minute by minute, Ava slowly lost consciousness. Her gaze wandered absent-mindedly over the gathered people, their faces contorted with horror. She could hear their screams, but could not understand their words. Her breathing was getting weaker and weaker, and deep down she knew that if help didn't come, she would die right there on the cold pavement. It seemed like an eternity before the ambulance arrived. The paramedics rushed to Ava, driven by the crowd, but the policeman didn't move. He watched them from a distance, as if this were just a scene in a movie, not his real responsibility. "Another racist cop!" Someone in the crowd shouted, and others echoed it. The shouts grew louder and louder, and the crowd grew more and more heated. People blamed the policeman, seeing in his actions not only personal cruelty, but also a reflection of the whole system. A system that time and again protected people like him, covering up their crimes. But the officer remained unfazed. He had done his job and wasn't going to get involved anymore. He already knew that the support of his colleagues would be on his side, that the system would always have his back. People like him were not afraid of the consequences. After all, they knew that people like Ava, black, unarmed, defenseless, always lost in this game. Michelle, a social worker, told Ava about it later when she was in the hospital recovering from surgery. "He didn't even try to help you," Michelle said bitterly, her voice soaked with anger. "That man saw you not as a person, but as a threat simply because of your skin color. And that's not an accident, Ava. This is a system that has used violence against people who look like you for centuries." Ava listened silently. There was no longer fear in her soul. It was now filled with anger and a desire for justice. "I won't let him get away with it," she said quietly but firmly. "He didn't just shoot me, he shot all of us." Those words spoken that day were the beginning of her struggle. Ava lay on the cold pavement, her breathing intermittent, almost imperceptible, but she was alive. The world around her blurred, but she could still feel it. Every breath was painful, every heartbeat labored. The blood slowly trickled from the wound in her head, staining the street. But in the back of her mind, there was a single desire to survive. The crowd around her grew louder and louder, but Ava heard it through the water. The screams, the accusations, the shock, it all blended into a single hum. People crowded around her, watching what had happened, and someone tried to give her first aid. But the policeman didn't move, didn't approach her, didn't lend a hand. His indifference was frightening. His face remained stony. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, but for Ava, those minutes took forever. She felt her life slowly slipping away from her, each breath getting harder, but some unknown force kept her fighting. Her body twitched weakly in spasms, as if her body refused to give up. The medics ran out of the car, piercing the space with desperate screams. "Get out of the way! Make room!" Panicked people began to part, making way for the doctors. They quickly approached Ava, leaning over her, checking her pulse and assessing her condition. One of them said, apparently to his colleagues, "She's alive. There's a lot of blood loss, but she's breathing." These words sounded like a thunderclap to the crowd. Some of the bystanders whispered, "She survived. My God, she's still alive." The shouts of outrage began to gradually change to breathless gasps as people watched doctors quickly and professionally administer first aid to Ava. One of the nurses panicked when she saw the amount of blood, but the head doctor, a man with a short gray haircut, said loudly, "Relax, she's strong, we'll make it." They fastened a cervical collar around her neck to secure the damaged vertebrae and began to treat the wound on her head to stop the bleeding. Ava, lying motionless, could still feel the cold of the instruments on her skin, but her strength was leaving her and she was sinking into a complete stupor. The policeman, the same officer who had fired the shot, stood aside, watching the doctor's fuss. He didn't move, didn't show the slightest interest in what was happening to the girl whose body was now fighting for life. When one of the paramedics, a young black man named Jamal, gave the policeman a judgmental glance, he shrugged as if the whole thing had nothing to do with him. "Are you serious?" Jamal couldn't stand it, looking back at the quo, whose face remained indifferent. "You're standing there like nothing happened? She's dying." The policeman didn't even bother to answer. He looked away, slowly turning his hand to the belt where his holster hung. "We do our jobs," he said dryly. "I did mine." Jamal shook his head, looking at the cop with disdain. "Is this your job? That's your job, shooting an unarmed girl?" he shouted, unrestrained by emotion. "Look at her. You almost killed her, and you don't care?" The crowd picked up on his words. People around him began shouting curses and accusations. Furious passers-by clenched their fists. Someone threw a plastic bottle at the policeman, who remained standing with the same nonchalant look. His cold gaze traveled through the crowd, but he showed neither fear nor embarrassment. "Stay away from me," he tossed over his shoulder, then turned to his colleagues who were just beginning to arrive on the scene. Meanwhile, the medics carefully lifted Ava onto the stretcher as they continued to check her pulse and condition. Her consciousness ebbed and flowed. In brief moments of clarity, she saw vague images around her, faces, silhouettes, flashes of light. But the pain throbbing in her head reminded her that she was still alive. Alive despite the bullets and the indifference of the one who was supposed to protect her. In the ambulance, as she was being laid on the gurney, she felt Michelle's, the social worker's, hand on hers. Michelle, who had miraculously appeared on the scene, whispered softly, "Hang in there, Ava. You're strong. We're not going to let them hide it." Those words sounded to Ava like a ray of light in the darkness. She could no longer respond, but a small flame burned inside her. She knew she had to survive, not just for her own sake, but for all this injustice to finally come out, for the voice of her pain and rage to be heard. As the ambulance sped away from the scene, leaving people on the street, the policeman finally turned to his colleagues who had just arrived. One of them, younger and less confident, approached him and quietly asked, "What happened? Did you really shoot her?" "She disobeyed an order," he said dryly, as if it were a simple fact. "I did what I had to do." The policeman knew what he was doing. Every move he made, every order he gave, was deliberate, calibrated. He could have said it was instinct, to protect himself from the threat he thought was coming from Ava. But deep down, he knew there was no threat. He had shot, not because he feared for his life, but because he was used to seeing black faces as a threat, the default culprits. As the crowd began to gather around him, his confidence didn't waver. There was obvious anger and shock in the eyes of the passers-by, people shouting, pointing at his gun, and the blood stain that was slowly growing around the girl lying on the pavement. He, on the other hand, stood looking at them with cold contempt, trying to maintain control of the situation. In his mind, this was still part of the job, a normal day on patrol, but the truth was he didn't call an ambulance right away. He stood and waited for others to do it, anyone but him. Passers-by, seeing Ava on the ground covered in blood, immediately sprang into action. One woman rushed to the phone, dialing 911, while others tried to stop the bleeding. "She's breathing, but she needs help now," shouted one of the women, sitting next to Ava, who lay half-conscious. Her shaking hands tried to cover the wound, blood oozing from between her fingers. From the other end of the street came shouts. "Where's the ambulance? Did somebody call an ambulance?" A man in a suit, who had probably witnessed everything, approached the policeman with an expression of rage on his face. "Aren't you gonna do anything? You should have called for help right after the shot was fired." The policeman did not blink or move. He cast a brief glance at the man and answered indifferently, "I called her. They're on their way." "I did everything by the book." It was a lie. In fact, he knew he hadn't called an ambulance immediately, although he could have. He was well aware that his actions would be questioned, but he had a ready version of events. The girl had disobeyed an order. He had acted within the scope of his job, protecting himself from a potential threat. Everything would look perfect in his report. No one would have noticed the delay in calling for help. The man didn't believe a word the cop said. His eyes flashed with anger. "You shot an unarmed girl and didn't even bother to help her." The policeman did not answer. His gaze was directed forward, past the man, toward the crowd, which was growing more and more heated. Someone threw a plastic bottle in his direction. Others shouted insults. He could see that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, but he was in no hurry to leave. He stood there with a stony expression on his face, as if what was happening did not concern him personally. The crowd was growing, and people passing by took out their phones, filming every moment. The whole street was buzzing with outraged voices. "That's racist! He just doesn't care about us!" shouted a young girl with a phone in her hands. "He purposely didn't call an ambulance so she'd die," came from the other end of the crowd. But the policeman already knew how to explain it all. In his report, it would look like this. He was acting within the law, protecting his life. When the girl started moving, he perceived it as a potential threat. Never mind that Ava's backpack contained only her papers and textbooks. It didn't matter that she was trying to show her innocence. In his eyes, she was only dangerous because she was black and had disobeyed orders at a speed he deemed sufficient. When the ambulance finally arrived, it wasn't because of his call. The passers-by couldn't stand by any longer. It was they, the ordinary people who saw this injustice, who made sure Ava got help. Medics rushed to the girl, their faces and hands covered in her blood as they tried to stop the bleeding and stabilize her condition. As the medics bent over Ava, checking her pulse, the officer slowly stepped aside. He felt no guilt, even though he knew his actions might cause a wave of outrage. In his mind, this was all business as usual. The system would always have his back, just as it had covered others before him. They won't understand, he thought of the crowd. To him, they were far removed from the real work he was doing. In his mind, he was doing his duty. But to those around him, to those who looked at Ava, wounded and bleeding on the pavement, he was more than just a policeman. He was a symbol of the very system that time and again used its power to punish and suppress, especially those whose skin was different from his. The policeman knew what he was doing. Every move he made, every order he gave was deliberate, calibrated. He could have said it was instinct to protect himself from the threat he thought was coming from Ava. But deep down he knew there was no threat. He'd shot, not because he feared for his life, but because he was used to seeing black faces as a threat, guilty by default. As the crowd began to gather around him, his confidence didn't waver. There was obvious anger and shock in the eyes of the passers-by, people shouting, pointing at his gun, and the blood stain that was slowly growing around the girl lying on the pavement. He, on the other hand, stood looking at them with cold contempt, trying to maintain control of the situation. In his mind, this was still part of the crime, a normal day on patrol. But the truth was, he didn't call an ambulance right away. He stood and waited for others to do it, anyone but him. Passers-by, seeing Ava on the ground covered in blood, immediately sprang into action. One woman rushed to the phone, dialing 911, while others tried to stop the bleeding. "She's breathing, but she needs help now," shouted one of the women sitting next to Ava, who lay half-conscious. Her shaking hands tried to cover the wound, blood oozing from between her fingers. From the other end of the street came screams. "Where's the ambulance? Did somebody call an ambulance?" A man in a suit who had probably witnessed everything approached the policeman with an expression of rage on his face. "Aren't you going to do anything? You should have called for help right after the shot was fired." The policeman did not blink or move. He cast a brief glance at the man and answered indifferently. "I called her. They're on their way. I did everything by the book." It was a lie. In fact, he knew he hadn't called an ambulance immediately, though he could have. He was well aware that his actions would be questioned, but he had a ready version of events. The girl had disobeyed an order. He had acted within the scope of his job, protecting himself from a potential threat. Everything would look perfect in his report. No one would have noticed the delay in calling for help. The man didn't believe a word the cop said. His eyes flashed with anger. You shot an unarmed girl and didn't even bother to help her. The policeman did not answer. His gaze was directed forward, past the man, toward the crowd, which was growing more and more heated. Someone threw a plastic bottle in his direction. Others shouted insults. He could see that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, but he was in no hurry to leave. He stood there with a stony expression on his face, as if what was happening did not concern him personally. The crowd was growing, and people passing by took out their phones, filming every moment. The whole street was buzzing with outraged voices. That's racist. He just doesn't care about us, shouted a young girl with a phone in her hands. He purposely didn't call an ambulance so she'd die, came from the other end of the crowd. But the policeman already knew how to explain it all. In his report, it would look like this. He was acting within the law, protecting his life. When the girl started moving, he perceived it as a potential threat. Never mind that Ava's backpack contained only her papers and textbooks. It didn't matter that she was trying to show her innocence. In his eyes, she was only dangerous because she was black and had disobeyed orders at a speed he deemed sufficient. When the ambulance finally arrived, it wasn't because of his call. The passers-by couldn't stand by any longer. It was they, the ordinary people who saw this injustice, who made sure Ava got help. Medics rushed to the girl, their faces and hands covered in her blood as they tried to stop the bleeding and stabilize her condition. As the medics bent over Ava, checking her pulse, the officer slowly stepped aside. He felt no guilt, even though he knew his actions might cause a wave of outrage. In his mind, this was all business as usual. The system would always have his back, just as it had covered others before him. They won't understand, he thought of the crowd. To him, they were far removed from the real work he was doing. In his mind, he was doing his duty, but to those around him, to those who looked at Ava, wounded and bleeding on the pavement, he was more than just a cop. He was a symbol of the very system that time and again used its power to punish and suppress, especially those whose skin was different from his. When the ambulance finally arrived on the scene, the doctors jumped out of the vehicle, their faces tense. One of the paramedics, Jamal, was the first to notice that a young black girl was lying on the ground bleeding. His heart clenched when he saw the extent of the damage, blood streaming across the pavement in Ava's lifeless stare. Shock and alarm flashed across the faces of the entire medical team. Shit, we're going to lose her if we don't hurry, Jamal said to his co-workers as he quickly rushed to the girl. They began to act instantly, checking her pulse and stabilizing her breathing while covering her head wound. The doctors exchanged concerned glances. The situation was critical, and every second mattered. But at that moment, the policeman approached the ambulance. His steps were measured, calm, as if he was sure of his every move. His cold gaze studied the paramedics who were trying to save Ava's life. He didn't seem to notice the panic and haste with which they were working. What happened? Asked the chief physician, without taking a break from his work. The policeman, without showing any emotion, uttered, She refused to follow my orders. I was forced to use force. I defended myself. The medics looked at each other. Bewilderment and indignation froze on their faces. Jamal, still working with Ava, threw in a look of irritation and disdain. Use force? Is that what you call defense? She's unarmed. You shot her in the head. The policeman didn't change his face. It was as if he had not heard the accusation in Jamal's voice. He repeated his dry, rehearsed story. She resisted. I gave her some clear instructions, but she refused to comply. This was a threat to me and others. I followed protocol. The medics continued their work, trying to save Ava, but it was clear that they were shocked by his words. The policeman tried to justify his violent behavior, seeing nothing unusual in it. One of the medics, an elderly woman with a short gray haircut who had worked on calls for years, turned to the officer, her face contorted with indignation. You shot her in the head. She wasn't even a threat. Where is your humanity? The officer only shrugged his shoulders, as if the words didn't matter to him. His face remained as cold and indifferent as ever. I was doing my duty, he answered, looking straight into the medic's eyes. And now I need medical attention. My actions were for protection. I'm under stress. I think it's best if you get me to a hospital. It's part of the procedure. The EMT was confused. Jamal seemed ready to explode with indignation, his eyes fixed directly on the policeman. "Do you seriously think this is about you now?" Jamal asked, seething with anger. "The girl you almost killed is lying here, between life and death, and you're asking us to take you to the hospital because of stress?" The officer didn't react. He was adamant, as if the situation was completely under his control. Everything that had happened, in his mind, was part of his job. Protecting himself, doing his duty, all this justified his actions, his cruelty, and indifference. "Yes," the policeman replied calmly. "I did what I was instructed to do, and now I need help." The medics were confused, especially those who saw the condition Ava was in. They knew they had a real victim in front of them, but the system dictated their rules. They could only follow protocols. And now, as absurd as it seemed, the officer who had almost killed the girl was demanding attention for himself. Jamal was on the verge of breaking down, but his coworker put a hand on his shoulder, reminding him that their first priority was to save Ava's life. "We're doing this for her," she whispered. They had no right to delay. Ava was quickly lifted onto a stretcher and loaded into the ambulance. The policeman, without a shred of remorse, prepared to follow them to the hospital. But one thing was clear to all who witnessed it. This man had not an ounce of sympathy. Inside the ambulance, paramedics fought desperately for Ava's life. Jamal, the paramedic, was focused on her condition, scrutinizing her every breath. The girl had lost a lot of blood, and the chances of survival were dwindling by the minute. Jamal leaned over to his colleague working nearby. "We need blood now or she won't make it to the hospital. It's a huge loss." His voice shook with tension. "We don't have a supply of the right group," the nurse whispered, fear sounding in her voice. Ava lay motionless, her face covered with blood, her eyes closed, but the machine they had hooked her up to showed she was still fighting. Every moment was important to her. Jamal couldn't bear the fact that the girl was dying right in his arms. He pounded on the wall of the ambulance, screaming at the driver, "Hurry up! She won't last!" The nurse, desperately trying to find a vein to inject Ava with medication, noticed her hands shake barely perceptibly. It was a faint sign of life, but still a sign. "She's still with us," she said with a heavy sigh. "We can't lose her. We just can't." Jamal, sensing that time was working against them, started calling the nearest hospital to reserve blood for a transfusion. But because of the rare type, there wasn't much in stock. He was told that the hospital had already started looking for donors, but it was taking time. "We don't have that time," Jamal snapped, but he couldn't afford to lose his temper. He leaned toward Ava again, watching her vitals. Meanwhile, the policeman who had returned to the station was sitting at his desk, filling out his report. He acted methodically, writing down all the details of the day. His report made the story look much simpler than it really was. He described his actions as a need for protection. A couple paragraphs, and it looked as if it had been a routine operation. The shooting was justified, the order given, the girl disobeyed. "I warned her," he wrote. Repeated the command twice. "She ignored my commands and made a sudden movement. This made me suspicious, and I was forced to act according to protocol to protect myself and others." He pressed the enter key, finalizing his report. There was no doubt in his mind that it all looked right. His version of events was short, without too much emotion, as the system demanded. The whole situation was reduced to a few lines of formal text. The policeman leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes, feeling tired. Everything that had happened, in his opinion, was just another unpleasant part of his job. There was no guilt or regret. Footsteps could be heard in the corridor. Other officers came and went, each going about their business, oblivious to the recent incident. The incident did not resonate much in the department. Shooting suspects, especially black suspects, was not uncommon. One of his colleagues looked into his office and asked with an indifferent expression on his face, "Everything all right? Did you fill out the report?" "Yes, everything is ready," the policeman replied, standing up. "Now I'll just go to the hospital. I have to be examined there." "Of course," grinned his colleague. "Don't worry, the protocol will cover it." The policeman nodded and headed for the exit. He was sure that what he had done was the right decision. To him, Ava was just another figure on his list. No one at the station saw anything unusual in this event. Everything he had done had to be part of his duty. Meanwhile, at the hospital, doctors were preparing for an emergency blood transfusion. Ava was taken to the operating table, her body almost completely exsanguinated. Surgeons gathered around, ready to operate. "We need more blood," shouted one of the doctors. "Her condition is critical." They were doing everything they could to stabilize her. At one point, one of the surgeons, a young man, stopped when he saw her scarred face. "How could you be so cruel?" he whispered, barely containing his emotions. But despite desperate attempts, time was too short. The doctors in the operating room were working hard to save Ava's life. Time was their worst enemy. Her condition was worsening every second. Doctors urged that he stabilize her circulation, finally getting donated blood for transfusion. The bullet lodged deep in her head posed a serious threat, and the surgeons knew the surgery would be difficult and dangerous. There was a tense silence in the operating room, interrupted only by the voices of the doctors and the sounds of medical instruments. The chief surgeon, Dr. Kim, was working intently, trying to carefully remove the bullet without damaging the vital vessels. Around him, assistants passed instruments, and nurses monitored the condition of the girl who was fighting for her life on the edge between death and salvation. "Carefully," said Dr. Kim, "the bullet is too close to the cranial artery. Any careless movement could be fatal." After hours of work, the surgeons managed to remove the bullet. Its winding path had left deep damage, especially to Ava's face and skull. However, the main task of keeping her alive had been accomplished. Dr. Kim, putting away the instruments, sighed heavily. "We've done everything we can. Now her future is in the hands of God or luck." Despite the life she had saved, Ava's face was irrevocably mangled. The bullet through her jaw and cheekbone had shattered bone and tissue, leaving deep scars. When the doctors finished their work, her face was left with an intricate mesh of stitches. All they could do was try to repair her face as best they could, but there could be no perfect reconstruction. A few days after the operation, Ava was still in critical condition, but she was breathing on her own. When she regained consciousness, the world around her was blurred. Her body felt heavy from all the interventions, but the biggest shock came when she touched her face for the first time. Pain and horror pierced her as her fingers felt the rough line of sutures and the asymmetrical shape of her jaw. What's wrong with me?" she wheezed, barely finding the words. The nurse on duty at her bedside came up quickly. "Please don't touch the stitches. You've had major surgery." Ava couldn't hold back her tears. She felt that her life would never be the same. The memories of that day, the screams of the policeman, the rattle of the gunshot, the fall to the pavement, all came back to her in waves of terror. But now a new feeling was added to it, fear of what she would see when she looked in the mirror. "I want to see myself," she whispered, and though the nurse tried to stop her, she was adamant. When the nurse brought out a small mirror, Ava hesitated for a moment, not daring to look. Taking the mirror in her hands, she slowly raised it to her face. What she saw made her freeze in horror. Her face was no longer her own. The deep scars and distorted features made her appearance unfamiliar. She pushed the mirror away and sobbed. "It's not me, it's not me." Meanwhile, the policeman sat in the chief's office, discussing the incident again. He knew that his report had been reviewed, and now it was just a matter of going through the formal procedures. The chief, a stone-faced man, leafed through the papers, nodding at each page. "So," the chief said, finally raising his head, "everything was done according to protocol. Did she really disobey orders?" The policeman nodded, maintaining the same cold tone. "Yeah, she was being aggressive, and then she made a sudden move. I had to protect myself." The supervisor nodded approvingly, putting his signature on the documents. "Good, you did the right thing. The system's got your back. Sometimes you have to take drastic measures, you know that. She could have been a threat." The policeman nodded again, though there was no doubt or remorse inside him. Everything looked clean and logical on paper. To him, this was just one incident among many of its kind, unlikely to cause serious repercussions. He knew that justice, as always, would be on his side. But for Ava, it was different. Every day, lying in her hospital room, she faced a new reality: physical pain, the pain of losing her former self, and the fear of a future that now seemed so unknown. Her life was divided into before and after. All because of one man who saw her not as a person, but as a threat, simply because of the color of her skin. It had been months since Ava had first opened her eyes in the hospital room, and she was finally allowed to go home. However, the word home no longer gave her the warm feeling she once had. The world around her had changed forever, and she felt that even the walls of her home, which were supposed to give her peace, had become alien. As she walked out of the hospital, the crumpled, white discharge paper in her hand seemed to symbolize her new beginning. But what would it be? She could no longer go back to her old life. Ava felt that her existence was now confined within the confines of that day, which, like ink, was forever embedded in her memory. It was cold outside, the autumn wind ruffled her hair, and her hood covered her disfigured face to hide the scars from prying eyes. Her face always reminded her of that night, the gunshot, the screams, and the indifference of the policeman who had left her for dead. Ava had realized long ago that her appearance would never be the same. Her face had become distorted from the surgery, the scars and uneven stitches pulling her skin away, making her face asymmetrical and disfigured. Even though the doctors had done everything they could, she knew that her reflection would always be a reminder of the horror she had endured. She couldn't forget that day. Never. It became her constant companion, like her scars. That day had become a bright, painful marker that divided her life into before and after. On the day of her discharge, her mother, Linda, met her at the hospital exit. The woman tried to smile, but there was anxiety and deep sadness in her eyes. She hugged her daughter, trying not to touch her face so as not to cause her unnecessary pain. Linda knew their lives had changed forever, and though she tried to be strong for Ava's sake, she felt a great heaviness inside herself. "Are you ready?" her mother asked quietly, looking at her daughter as if she were asking not about going home, but about whether Ava would be able to live a normal life again. Ava only nodded. She felt like a stranger in her own body. It was as if, after the shooting, she had not only been physically disfigured, but something important that made her herself had been stolen. In public, she hid her face under a hood or wide scarves, but every time someone casually cast a glance at her, she felt judgment and fear on her. These were not the stares she was used to before, when she was a carefree, smiling girl. Now she was seen differently, as a victim, as a victimized person. And she hated it. When they got home, Ava stopped in front of the hallway mirror. It was large, reflecting her entire silhouette. She couldn't bring herself to move closer, but her gaze caught on the reflection nonetheless. The scars were ugly and loud, like symbols of pain and fear. She felt her heart clench with horror and disgust at herself. Her mother came up behind her, putting her hand on Ava's shoulder. "You're strong," Linda said softly. "You'll survive." But Ava couldn't believe those words. She could still hear the screams in her head. Remember the moments before the shooting, when she had argued with the policeman who refused to see her as human. It all sat deep inside her, like a poison that was slowly eating away at her soul. Life after the hospital was difficult. Ava could no longer go outside without being stared at by passersby. She was shunned, fingers were pointed at her, and sometimes she heard whispers behind her. Even children on the street looked at her face in horror, which only added to her sense of isolation. She avoided mirrors, unable to look at her reflection without crying. Every night she woke up with nightmares. In them, she found herself back on that street again and again, hearing the cold voice of the policeman, the orders echoing in her head, and then feeling again the deafening impact of the bullet and the fall to the cold asphalt. Sometimes she could even hear his footsteps after the shot, measured and indifferent. He wasn't in a hurry, he didn't care. With each passing day, Ava tried to pull herself together to move on with her life. But what kind of life was that? Her future seemed dim, and although she physically survived, emotionally she was still in that moment, that nightmare. Those around her saw her as a symbol of fighting police brutality, but inside she felt torn apart. One evening, sitting by the window and looking out at the twilight, Ava realized that her life would indeed never be the same. She had to rebuild her identity, to find the strength to live with those scars, not only on her face but on her heart as well. It had been several months since the day Ava had been discharged from the hospital. Time seemed to move slowly, but her mental wounds were not healing as quickly as she would have liked. She continued to live in a world where every day she was reminded of a gunshot, a policeman's scream, a cold indifference. Her face remained mangled, but the pain that was tearing her from the inside was even more devastating. She rarely left the house, trying to avoid crowded places. Every time she saw her reflection, it seemed to her that the girl she had been before the shooting was gone forever. The scars not only covered her face, but cut through her heart, changing the way she looked at the world. There was too much pain, too many memories that couldn't be erased. Ava sat on the balcony of her apartment one evening, wrapped in a warm blanket. The autumn wind blew coolly against her face, but it was the rare quiet she was beginning to appreciate. The city was distant and noisy, but here on the balcony she managed to find some peace. She stared at the fireflies of the lights far below, and her thoughts returned to the day that had been the turning point in her life. The memories came back to her, the policeman, his harsh voice, his orders, his face full of cold contempt. He didn't see her as a person, just a target, an object. He felt no regret or compassion after the shooting, and it was driving Ava crazy. He was sure he had done the right thing by following his instructions, but her life was ruined forever. She couldn't understand how this was possible, how one moment could turn her life into this endless nightmare. The policeman seemed distant from her. His world remained the same while she tried to survive in her new body, in her new reality. Despite all this, Ava began to find the strength to move on. It was a struggle. Every day, every look on her face, every step onto the street where other people's eyes were looking at her. But she didn't want to be a victim anymore. Yes, she was left permanently crippled, but she was determined that her life would not be defined by a single gunshot. It would not be the end of her story. Over time, Ava began to write. She expressed her feelings, fears, and pain on paper, as if each paragraph she wrote helped her to let go of some of her suffering. Her writing became a voice for those who could not tell their story, whose lives were shattered just as hers had been. People began to read her work, and many found in it a reflection of their own traumas. Her voice became important. People started to listen to her. She was no longer just a victim of police violence. She became a symbol of the struggle for justice. Olyva still bore the scars on her face, but now they were not just bullet scars, but symbols of her resilience, her strength, and her ability to overcome the horrors of the past. Time passed, and Ava gradually learned to accept herself as she was. Her face would never be the same. Her life would never go back to what it was before the gunshot. But now she knew that strength wasn't always about appearing unharmed. True strength is about overcoming pain, fear, and injustice, and going forward despite it all. Though that day would forever be a part of her story, she no longer let it define her life. Now she was writing her own destiny, and it wasn't the story of a victim, but of a survivor. As the story of Yue comes to a close, I want to thank you for being with me on this journey. This story is as much about pain and suffering as it is about strength, resilience, and hope. I hope you found something in it that resonated in your hearts, and perhaps it will inspire you to think about the importance of justice and human dignity. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.